1. c4. The English opening immediately stakes a claim on the d5 square and prepares to contest the center, offering flexibility in piece development and potentially leading to transpositions into other common openings. This move, nf6, is a flexible and common response to White's English opening, often leading to systems like the King's Indian defense or symmetrical variations, allowing Black to develop a piece and control central squares while delaying a definitive pawn commitment. This move develops a knight, controls central squares d5 and e4, and maintains flexibility for White's pawn structure, allowing for various continuations like the English opening or a queen's pawn game transposition. This move prepares to develop the king's bishop and form a solid pawn structure, leading towards a Queen's Indian or Nimzo-Indian setup, a common and flexible response to White's English opening. This move develops the knight to a central square, preparing to castle kingside and maintaining flexibility in the pawn structure, hinting at a possible Queen's Indian defense or Catalan setup. This move immediately challenges White's control of the center and signals Black's intention to play an active, dynamic game, often leading to variations of the Queen's Indian or Nimzo-Indian defenses. This move establishes a classical pawn center, aiming to control key squares and create attacking opportunities while defining the opening as a Queen's Gambit decline setup. This move develops a piece towards the center, preparing for castling and indirectly supporting the central pawn on d5, while also creating the potential for future diagonal pressure. This move consolidates White's central pawn structure, preparing to castle kingside and develop the remaining pieces harmoniously within the framework of a Queen's Indian or Catalan-like formation. This move fulfills the fundamental opening principle of king safety, allowing the piece development to continue and preparing to connect the rooks. This move prepares to castle kingside and develops the bishop to a more active square, supporting the central pawn structure. This move introduces the Catalan structure, aiming to fianchetto the queen's bishop to g7 where it will exert pressure along the long diagonal and support central pawn expansion. This move completes kingside castling, a crucial step in securing the king and preparing to transition towards the middle game by potentially activating rooks and bishops. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to challenge White's control of the d4-h8 diagonal and potentially support a queenside expansion. The queen move to e2 prepares to connect the rooks after castling and supports a potential advance of the kingside pawns or a transfer of the queen to a more active square on the kingside. This move aims to develop the knight to a more active square and support a potential c5 pawn advance, contesting the center and opening lines for Black's pieces. This move prepares to exert pressure on the d-file, potentially supporting a future d4-d5 pawn push or reinforcing the d-pawn in response to Black's maneuvering. Black's knave4 repositions the knight to a central outpost, potentially preparing to exchange for White's strong knight on c3 or to support a future, circa 5, advance, aiming to disrupt White's pawn center. This move prepares to reroute the bishop to a more active diagonal and potentially support a queenside pawn advance after the knight on e4 is dealt with. Black immediately challenges White's central pawn structure, seeking to break open the position and create counterplay on the queenside. This move prepares to transfer the bishop to a more active diagonal on the kingside, often targeting the f2 square or supporting a potential kingside attack. This move challenges White's central pawn control, aiming to open lines and activate Black's pieces, potentially leading to tactical skirmishes in the center. This pawn capture opens the e-file for white's rook and frees the d-pawn, creating potential for central pawn advances and influencing the play of black's knight on d7. This move continues the active development of black's pieces, rerouting the knight to a more central square where it can potentially support a kingside attack or facilitate further pawn breaks. This move prepares to develop the queenside bishop to b2, reinforcing the central pawn structure and potentially creating attacking pressure on the long diagonal. This move strategically places the rook on the c-file, contesting control and preparing for potential pawn breaks or tactical skirmishes that might arise along this open line. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, controlling key central squares and preparing for potential tactical skirmishes while also reinforcing the e4 outpost against black's pawn advances. This move initiates a classic exchange in the Queen's Indian defense structure, aiming to simplify the position and potentially create an isolated pawn for white if dxc3 is played. This recapture maintains the structural integrity of white's pawn center and prepares to contest the open c-file, a crucial objective in this Queen's Indian defense structure. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, preparing to challenge white's control of the c-file and potentially support a pawn advance or create tactical threats against white's kingside. This move initiates a pawn advance on the queenside, aiming to gain space and potentially create weaknesses in black's structure or open lines for white's pieces. Black reinforces the c5 square and prepares to potentially challenge white's queenside expansion with b5. This move repositions the rook to the open c-file, reinforcing control and preparing for potential pawn pushes on the queenside. Black's queen repositions to the a8 square, potentially preparing to transfer to the kingside or support an advance along the queenside. This move reinforces the e4 square and prepares to activate the king's knight, offering white more central control and potential attacking prospects. This move prepares to challenge white's control of the d-file by bringing the rook into active play, potentially leading to exchanges or creating threats against white's center. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on the b1h7 diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses around black's king and supporting the e4-e5 pawn push. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to exchange it for white's active knight on e5 and gain control over the key c4 square. The move 20. qd3 repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting a central pawn push or preparing to participate in operations on the queenside. This move aims to create luft for the king and prepare for potential kingside pawn advances, while also clearing the g6 square for other pieces to maneuver. This move re-centralizes the queen, aiming to support the e3-e4 pawn push and potentially reposition for attack on the kingside or defense against black's developing counterplay on the queenside. The move bf8 is a defensive retreat, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially support a future kingside pawn advance. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to influence the center and potentially support a kingside attack or defend against black's queenside expansion. Black redirects the rook to the open c-file, contesting white's control and preparing to challenge the d4 pawn. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to support the central pawn push and potentially develop an attack along the c-file. The bishop retreats to g7, consolidating its position on the long diagonal and preparing to support a potential kingside pawn advance or simply remain a passive defender for now. This move prepares to double rooks on the d-file, aiming to exploit the central tension and potentially open lines against black's king. This move begins a gradual redeployment of the knight, aiming to reposition it from the somewhat passive e8 square towards a more active central or kingside outpost after further maneuvering. The bishop moves to a more active square, aiming to control the important e4 square and potentially support a future pawn advance on the kingside. The knight repositions to d6, aiming to challenge white's control of the e4 square and prepare for potential pawn advances or piece exchanges on the kingside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to contest the light squares and potentially support a kingside advance. The move nf5 strategically repositions the knight to a more active central square, challenging white's control and preparing to exploit potential weaknesses in white's pawn structure. On the kingside, this move repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to support potential breakthroughs or challenge black's control of the open central files. The rook moves to d8 to support the potential advance of the knight to f5 and to prepare for a possible occupation of the d file if white's d4 pawn advances. White initiates a pawn push on the kingside, aiming to create space for their pieces and potentially exploit weaknesses after black's king's knight has moved to the less active f5 square. Capturing on c4 opens the c-file for black's rook and challenges white's pawn structure while potentially activating black's knight to e4. This move recaptures the pawn on c4, opening the c-file and challenging black's control of that important central file. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square on the diagonal, supporting the knight's advance and potentially preparing for a queenside expansion. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to exploit the slightly weakened kingside pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances against black's king. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal and prepares to challenge white's control of the central squares, particularly aiming to restrict the powerful knight on f5. This pawn sacrifice opens the h-file, aiming to disrupt black's kingside defense and create attacking chances against the weakened castled position. This capture opens the h-file, creating immediate tactical possibilities and a direct confrontation for control of the central and kingside squares. This pawn push aggressively attacks the black king's position, aiming to open lines and create attacking chances by exploiting the weakened kingside pawn structure. This knight repositions to a more active central square, preparing to contest the open files and potentially target white's weak pawn structure on the kingside. This move exchanges a key defender of black's queenside pawn structure, aiming to exploit the resulting open lines and potential weaknesses on that side of the board for white's rooks and queen. This recapture is essential to regain material equality and directly challenges white's centrally placed bishop, aiming to simplify the position. This move repositioned the rook to a more active central file, aiming to challenge black's control and potentially support pawn advances or piece maneuvers on the queenside. This move repositions the rook from the d-file, where it was under pressure, to the c-file, establishing a doubled rook battery on an open file and preparing to contest control of the crucial c-file. White repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to increase pressure on black's position along the open d-file and potentially prepare for further pawn advances or piece exchanges. This move decisively occupies the open c-file, aiming to exploit the vulnerable queenside and create threats against white's king. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, preparing to contest the vital d5 square and potentially support a central pawn advance or a Queenside expansion. The rook moves to b2, preparing to penetrate white's queenside and target the weak b3 pawn, while also increasing pressure on the c2 square. White centralizes the rook to the c1 square, a more active post that directly contests the open c-file and supports potential pawn advances on the queenside. This exchange is a necessary simplification, as it removes the immediate tension and clarifies the material balance, leading towards a more open endgame with potential advantages for white on the kingside. This queen recapture maintains material equality and prepares to contest the open c-file, crucial for controlling the board and initiating pawn breaks. This move sacrifices a pawn to open up the rook on the b-file, aiming to create tactical opportunities against white's vulnerable king and potential weaknesses in the pawn structure. White recaptures the pawn, opening the b-file for potential counterplay, but allowing black's rook to become active on the third rank. This move recaptures the pawn on b3, aiming to simplify the position and reduce white's attacking potential, though black now faces potential weaknesses in the queenside pawns. This move activates the queen, threatening the weak pawn on f7 and controlling crucial central squares, while also preparing to potentially support a kingside pawn push or exchange pieces to simplify. This move aims to consolidate the queen's position and offer exchanges, potentially simplifying into an endgame where white's connected passed pawns on the queenside will be a significant advantage. This move initiates a strong counterplay on the queenside, aiming to exploit the pin on white's c-pawn and potentially trap black's queen or create a passed pawn. This move aims to reactivate the bishop, potentially creating threats on the queenside and reinforcing the defense of the d5 pawn. Though white's strong knight on c6 poses a significant challenge, this move captures a pawn and aims to exploit black's somewhat loose pawn structure, while also simplifying the position to an endgame where white has a material advantage and a more active queen. This move is a desperate attempt to create counterplay by capturing the pawn, but it overlooks the immediate threat of 43 nxe7+, winning material and severely compromising the king's safety. This checks the black king and forces a recapture, disrupting black's plan of coordinating their queen and bishop and potentially leading to further material gain for white. The king needs to escape the immediate threats and find safety, so kg7 moves him to a slightly more protected square on the diagonal. This queen sacrifice is a decisive tactic to force a decisive advantage by clearing the path for the passed pawn and creating an unstoppable mating attack. The move 44 qxg4+ is a desperate attempt to regain material and create counterplay by sacrificing the queen, but it overlooks the immediate checkmate threat after 45 qxf8 hash.